representatives from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in Uganda and the Bank of Uganda, distinguished guests who have traveled from near and far, and fellow colleagues from the World Bank. My name is Noriana Fernando. I'm an External Affairs Officer at the World Bank. It's my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies this morning. I also will extend a special welcome to people from around the world across time zones who are joining us virtually on Zoom and YouTube. I hear we have nearly 100 people connected, and we thank them for their patience as well. The World Bank is pleased to be co-organizing this high-level event together with the Ugandan Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. This morning's event is among a series of events organized under the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, or SDFP. I'm sure you'll hear more about that very soon. We have some very special guests here today, and you will hear them speak on stage about debt sustainability. It's a topic that touches all Ugandan lives and all Ugandan futures. I welcome everyone in the room and all those tuning in virtually to be part of the conversation. Today is about dialogue. There are two ways you can do this. One, using the hashtag UGDebtConference, which you see up here on the screens. The second way is by sharing your questions and comments during the audience Q&A, which we will get to at around 11:15 a.m. And we invite people in the room to use the mic that will be set up, and people online to send questions on the chat and on the comments section. In the meantime, to start the conversation, it is my great pleasure to welcome on stage Mukami Karayuki, the World Bank's Country Manager for Uganda.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to start by saying, Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, I understand he's just about to arrive. The Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, Chair of the National Planning Authority, representatives of the different government ministries, departments and agencies present, development partners, civil society representatives, academia, all our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to warmly welcome you to this event, Building Stronger Partnerships for Sustainable Financing in Uganda. Let me also thank you for joining us as we focus our discussion on the important issue of Uganda's public debt. I'm aware that many of you know and understand the importance of this topic, which is not new, as it has been discussed in many different fora. However, allow me to give you a brief context on why this discussion is critical at this important juncture for the country. And I'll stop just for a second to welcome the Minister. Honorable Minister, you haven't missed much. I just started, so I'll just continue from where I am. So I was saying that most of you are here because, like those of us from the World Bank, you understand the gravity of debt and the importance of its management and sustainability. I say gravity because debt is an essential and a critical element of development. Indeed, well-managed debt can drive sound development and accelerate the attainment of development outcomes. But I also say gravity because high public debt can inhibit private investment, increase fiscal pressure, reduce social spending, and limit government's ability to implement reforms. Therefore, ensuring debt sustainability is critical. It has implications for all sectors and all populations in a country. Part of our engagement with our member countries therefore centers around monitoring debt. For example, our debtor reporting system, which helps to closely monitor trends. In addition, jointly with the IMF, we undertake an annual debt sustainability assessment to keep track of debt performance and risks. And more recently, since July 2020, we introduced the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, which aims to improve debt transparency, strengthen debt management, and enhance fiscal sustainability. This event is part of a series of activities we are holding jointly with the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Development to discuss this policy. And on behalf of my country director, Keith Hansen, who is unable to join us today, let me take this opportunity to introduce my colleague, the World Bank's director in the Department of Development Finance, responsible for IDA mobilization and IBRD corporate finance, Samuel Munzele Maimbo, who's traveled here from headquarters to engage with you and will also help us to elaborate on many of these issues. This discussion on debt comes at an unprecedented time for the world, and between COVID-19, recent conflicts and climate change, the global economy has come under stress, and our collective effort to get back on track on a path to economic recovery is losing steam as the compounded effects of the recent shocks we have experienced and continue to face negatively impacts our capacity to respond. As you're all aware, Uganda was hit hard by COVID, and I think all of us witnessed the domestic lockdown, the border and school closures, other disruptions, and of course the devastating human toll of the virus. Along with many others, the World Bank's International Development Association, or IDA, provided financing through various projects to support both the initial response through, for example, expanding equitable access to vaccines, but also are working with government towards the long-term response. And this is to rebuild a resilient and inclusive economy. Following the easing of lockdown restrictions between October 2021 and February 2022, the economy began to rebound strongly. It was expected to continue gaining buoyancy until we began to experience global headwinds. These forces threatened to reduce Uganda's growth to below the 6% target of GDP in fiscal years 2023 and 2024 because of trade disruptions, an increased aversion to risk, and higher commodity prices. In fact, as economies started to lift coronavirus constraints, pent-up demand and constrained supplies had already led to a broad-based increase in commodity prices. However, today, the Ukraine crisis is further disrupting supply chains and increasing prices of commodities. For instance, soaring wheat prices affecting importers across Africa, especially those in countries in East Africa, including Uganda, who are dependent on imports from Russia and Ukraine. In addition, costlier inputs like fertilizers and fuels, leading to lower productivity and posing challenges for Uganda's agricultural-led growth, food security, and household incomes. Additionally, these forces are weighing on economic activity and posing challenges to the conduct of monetary policy among central banks worldwide. Uganda is no exception, and mounting risk and uncertainty from these challenges will stretch public finances as well as raise debt further. These recent shocks also exacerbate long-standing development challenges that will require urgent attention to ensure the country remains on a sustainable growth path. First, Uganda is one of the youngest countries in the world, with 46% of the population aged 14 or less, and therefore the country's population is one of its greatest assets. Indeed, our World Bank Human Capital Index, which scores countries with regards to how well they perform, notes that Uganda has a score of 38%, meaning that a child born in Uganda today is likely to just be one-third productive when they reach adulthood, at today's level of education and health. So it is essential to have the fiscal space to make sustained investments in education, jobs, health, and social protection. Secondly, Uganda has abundant natural resources that remain underdeveloped, including agriculture, which is the main source of livelihood for the population. Yet the country has a low level of productivity at this moment, as it's still operating mainly at subsistence level. So there's lots of opportunity to try to work on increasing productivity in this natural resource area. Thirdly, despite huge investments in infrastructure to date, Uganda still has a big infrastructure deficit, and it is widening rapidly as a result of the lack of resources as well as the pace of population growth. So consistent with the third National Development Plan for FY fiscal year 21 to 25, our recent systematic country diagnostic update emphasized the need to prioritize macro fiscal stability, governance and service delivery, human development and women's empowerment, green growth, sustainable urbanization and resilience, and agricultural commercialization and private sector competitiveness. I think these are the themes that you will be hearing from us about in the coming year as we work towards preparing our next country partnership framework. While Uganda's debt is still sustainable, the level of indebtedness is rising and rising fast. So the challenges highlighted above place the country at a crossroads vis-a-vis how best to pursue development and make sure it is sustainable. So let me turn to my colleague, Samuel Maimbo, who will elaborate further on this. And I would like to end with my earlier message that this conversation is taking place at the right time. We have the opportunity collectively to help Uganda to ensure a more sustainable, higher growth, and inclusive future for her people. And we look forward to hearing from you on your thoughts, reflections, and suggestions on what to do with regards to ensuring Uganda's debt management and sustainability is attained. Thank you very much for listening to me, and let me welcome Samuel to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. Coming from Zambia, a very traditional society, I will certainly not be speaking before the minister speaks. So I'd like to invite the minister to speak, and I will speak after you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Your Excellencies, the ambassadors, the heads of delegations, heads of corporations, permanent secretary and secretary to the Treasury, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I think it is in order for me to introduce myself, since our guest from, is it Zambia, did not introduce me properly. My name is Henry Musasizi. I am Minister of State for general duties in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. And also, I am a member of the Ugandan Parliament, where I have been for the last 11 years. I want to once again greet you all. I am pleased to welcome you to this conference that provides us with a window for positive exchange on how to improve the financing of our development needs. I am honored to be speaking to you at this high-level outreach conference aimed at strengthening coordination between Uganda and our various creditors to discuss issues pertaining to debt sustainability. Allow me, in a special way, to thank the World Bank for organizing this conference and for offering my ministry the opportunity to co-host this event. This collaboration is what explains effective partnership. I take this opportunity to extend special welcome to development financing partners that have been able to join us today from the multilateral and bilateral organizations, as well as from the private sector, especially those from the commercial banks. This engagement will go a long way in enabling us to fulfill the commitments we made at the GOU Netherlands Government Joint Regional Debt Conference that was held in Kampala in February 2020. We committed, among other key resolutions, to strengthen coordination with our creditors while pursuing increased transparency in debt contraction and management. It is evident that the COVID-19 pandemic took a great toll on governments all over the world in their pursuit for macroeconomic stability. Uganda has in the past 2 years experienced a slowdown in economic activity with adversely affected revenue mobilization and resulted in 2 significant budgetary shortfalls. In financial year 2019-2020, the real GDP growth declined to 3%, falling short of the planned target of 6.8%. Nonetheless, economic activity picked up in the financial year 2020-2021 following the easing of lockdown restrictions and discovery of a vaccine, with growth rising from 3.3% below the NDP 3 target of 4.5%. Domestic tax collection experienced a decline from 16,163 billion in financial year 2018-2019 to 15,912 billion in financial year 2019-2020. In terms of domestic tax to GDP, this decline corresponds to a reduction from 12.2% down to 11.4% over the same period. This has led to widening of the fiscal deficit from 4.9% in financial year 2018-2019 to 7.1% in financial year 2019-2020 and to 9.9% in the financial year 2020-2021. These challenges came at a time when the government is prioritizing infrastructure development programs and upscaling social service delivery in accordance with our National Development Plan. Government therefore has had to acquire additional financing through highly concessional and non-concessional borrowing, thus increasing the fiscal risks. On account of implementing our strategies to support economic recovery, public debt has steadily risen and is projected to go above the 50% threshold we set for ourselves in the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility. It was 35.4% of GDP in financial year 2018-2019, rose to 40.7% in financial year 2019-2020, and by the end of financial year 2021, it was at 49.9%. Uganda's total public debt stock rose from United States dollars 9.35 billion in financial year 2016-2017 to United States dollars 15.26 billion in financial year 2019-2020, and later jumping to United States dollars 19.46 in financial year 2020-2021. As at December 2021, it stood at US dollars 20.74 billion. The rise in domestic borrowing from 3.4% of GDP in financial year 2019-2020 to 4.95% of GDP by May of financial year 2021-2022 is way above the NDP3 target of 1.99% of GDP. This has resulted in a significant growth in interest payments from 17% to 21% of domestic revenues during the same period. The high interest payments have greatly limited the fiscal space, thus affecting implementation of government programs. As it has been in the past, our development partners have continued to support the Ugandan government, both in terms of financing the budget, advisory services, and capacity building over the years. Your support has helped the country to navigate and remain resilient during the hard times, including but not limited to the COVID-19 storm. Nonetheless, even with this increased borrowing, I want to assure you, our distinguished partners, ladies and gentlemen, that Uganda's debt remains sustainable in the medium and in the long term. That notwithstanding, Uganda's risk of debt distress has increased from low to moderate, following the remnants from the pandemic and other ongoing global uncertainties. We continue to face challenges in managing our debt portfolio as a result of low performance of domestic tax revenues and the vulnerabilities associated with debt management. Engagements such as this are therefore of utmost importance. They are instrumental in enabling us adequately address the existing debt sustainability challenges while harnessing ways of improvement of the balance of payments, enhancement of the contributions of the export sector, and expanding the tax base. Since government will continue borrowing for investment, and key development programs, it calls for improved favorable financing terms and review of the related conditions, as well as assistance in management of existing global market risks that may affect our capacity to manage the already existing debt. We find some of the conditions to be very stringent for Uganda, since we have never defaulted on debt servicing. Government is committed to maintain our debt within sustainable levels in the medium term. This will be done through implementing our medium-term debt management strategy that aims at managing the costs and the risks associated with the public debt portfolio. We have also finalized the public investment financing strategy, which will align existing financing options to appropriate government programs to achieve value for money and attain long-term fiscal sustainability. The government will also create an enabling framework for private sector participation in the economic growth and development through financing of other NDP 3 programs. Further, we continue to implement the domestic revenue mobilization strategy, whose focus is to reduce the fiscal deficit and to relieve government of expensive borrowings. In line with our budget theme of full monetization of the Ugandan economy through commercial agriculture, industrialization, expanding and broadening services, digital transformation, and market access, the budget will focus on delivering 3 broad policy objectives. Number 1 is transitioning the vulnerable subsistence households to the money economy through implementation of the parish development model. Number 2, enhancing business recovery programs to help businesses weather the COVID-19 storm and restore lost jobs. And number 3, safeguarding households from the escalating prices of essential commodities. The above three strategic areas will be financed using not only our domestic revenues, but also other appropriate options of financing. As I conclude, my appeal is that the conference will allow for constructive discussions that enable government and the partners agree on feasible ways of addressing Uganda's key debt-related risks. I am looking forward to hearing the actionable outcomes of this conference and being involved in the future dialogue. Once again, I would like to appreciate the World Bank for this initiative and to encourage candid discussions pertaining to sustainable financing of Uganda's development needs. With these remarks, I therefore declare this conference open for God and my country.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Honorable Henry Musasizi, Minister of State for Finance, Planning and Economic Development at Uganda. As we prepare for a conversation on Uganda's debt and development trajectory, I welcome on stage Samuel Maimbo, World Bank Director for Development Finance.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your kind words and for laying out much more precisely than I could possibly manage with regards to Uganda's position. And in expressing my thanks for your willingness to host us today, let me also say that this is the policy we're going to discuss today is a new policy. It's about 2 years old. And we've had a series of conversations, and this is the first time we're doing it in country. And anyone who is willing and comfortable discussing matters of debt in this environment deserves a special thanks. And so with that, on behalf of the World Bank, I'm especially grateful that we're meeting here. And I'll also cheat because I'll make reference to a number of things that both the Minister and Mukami made reference to. And this is merely the fact that Uganda today is at a crossroads. On one hand, debt is sustainable. On the other hand, no one is immune to the global crisis that we face today. Coming out of COVID, facing rising energy prices, food prices, and a host of other challenges like we've never seen before. So in this particular context, we have certainly seen at the World Bank that there's been there's a significant increase in debt across the world. In either or developing countries, this is as much as 200% of GDP. Now, just to be clear, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with debt. The problem comes in when you have significant levels of debt with rising interest rates, declining growth, and a host of other challenges taking place at the same time. We don't have precedent of countries doing well in this environment. And so, in as much as we are comforted by the fact that Uganda has only moved to moderate risk, that its level of debt to GDP has only moved from 41 to 50%, I think the Minister is absolutely right that it is time to have this conversation. And when I reflect on my own country, Zambia, I certainly wish that we had had this conversation 5 years ago. Now, because the media is here, let me make it clear that I made that statement as a Zambian national, not as a World Bank official. That said, Uganda is not alone in the trends that we see across the region. So in East Africa, for example, we have seen that the portion of financing going to interest payments has doubled from about 5% to about 9% over the last 10 years. When we think about the levels of vulnerability as well, the numbers are all going in the wrong direction. About 10 years ago, we had about 7 countries that were at low risk of debt vulnerability or debt distress. Today, that number has fallen to 0. Equally, about 10 years ago, we had about 6 countries that were at high risk of debt distress. Today, that number has doubled to 12. With all of these statistics going in the wrong direction, the World Bank has had a 2-pronged approach. So the first approach is to significantly raise the amount of concessional financing that is available to countries. And so we spent the greater part of last year replenishing IDA and successfully managed to raise $93 billion to go to developing countries. But in all honesty, it was a very difficult journey because if you've looked at the trends over the last 20 years, the amount of concessional financing has actually been falling. So in as much as we celebrate the $93 billion that we raised, it did come at slightly more stringent terms than what we would certainly have liked to achieve. And therefore, yesterday when we met with technical officials at the Ministry of Finance, we had a chance to elaborate on the transition from previous packages of 50% grants and 50% credits to 50-year credits. Now, this financing is still highly concessional, but it does trigger an alarm bell that in future rounds of replenishment, these terms will only become harder. Now, having raised money, the other part of our 2-pronged approach is also to make sure that the money is being used in as sustainable a manner as we possibly can. And this was really the trigger for the introduction of the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, which itself has 2 components. So the first component focuses on enhancing sustainable debt finance program. And this program allows or invites the bank to work with countries to develop performance and policy actions that are reviewed every year, that are designed to be an incentive mechanism to do the right thing when it comes to debt. And when this takes place, the country gets its full IDA allocation. As I mentioned earlier, this policy has been in place for the last 2 years. In the first year, we implemented it across 55 IDA countries. Together, we had developed some 122 policy performance actions, and I'm pleased to say that 93% of the countries were able to implement these actions. In the second year, we increased the number. We worked with 48 countries and had 151 policy performance actions. Now, to be fair, 3 policy performance actions will not solve a country's debt problems. But what we do hope we will achieve with these discussions is that it will help authorities focus on the 3 key drivers that will make a difference. And if we keep this going on an annual basis, pretty much in the same way you run a marathon, that with time we will improve the debt sustainability of countries. In the 2 years that we've implemented this, I'm also pleased to say that on average, we have seen improvements in the quality of data that's being published. So if you look at the low-income countries, we found that there's been a 17% increase of countries that are now reporting in much greater detail both public and private sector debt. If you look at the International Debt Statistics Report, we have also seen that there's progress being made about reporting debt. But to be sure, there's still a lot of work to be done. We still have work to be done in terms of state-owned enterprises and the debt that they contract without government guarantees. But this is work that is really important for us to work together. Now, the second pillar, which I really should focus, is the process by which we bring together debtors and creditors and have an honest conversation about what's going well and what isn't going well. And certainly this event is as important as they come when it comes to implementing a policy on debt. Now, because the minister was quite detailed in his elaboration of the situation in Uganda, and Mukami did as well in terms of the global situation, let me be brief and simply end on 3 key areas where we can all work together to improve the debt sustainability of countries across the world. So the first is really to address debt head-on and help countries address their debt vulnerabilities as candidly, as frankly as we can. This is not something that we can ignore and will go away. And part of this effort does involve making sure that we are finding the right amounts of concessional financing, we're deploying it as effectively as we can, and importantly, we're looking at financing as a portfolio rather than a single bullet to help with development. And addressing debt vulnerabilities is as much an element of development as they come. I have to say that in working with so many countries, there's certainly a lot to celebrate in terms of the progress that has been made in reducing poverty over the last few decades. But it has been challenging to witness that with COVID, just in the last 3 years, some of these countries have fallen back 10 years. And that is a challenge, that there's 100 million people who will now be faced with poverty yet again, that there are 13 million people who will face hunger in the next couple of years. So in many respects, a lot of the development work is going back to basics about how we've managed our finances. So that's one. The second thing is about debt transparency. Now, debt data allows you to make informed decisions. It allows you to tackle the priorities that the minister outlined for a government such as we have here in Uganda. This is the same for governments across the world. And one of the things that we have been doing with the policy performance actions is making them public. So you can go to a website that allows you to see every single policy and performance action across the entire portfolio. And then finally, the last point I will emphasize in addressing debt vulnerabilities, improving debt transparency, is simply the basic work of collaboration. There is no way that sitting in Washington, we will come here with ready-made solutions that will work in Uganda. The only way we do that is to come here, sit across the table, and hear from you directly which policies are working and which ones are not. And if we do this enough times with all of the governments that we work with all of the creditors and the debtors, I am confident that we will ride out this storm. It's certainly bigger than what we've dealt with before, man-made disasters, wars, but I remain confident in the faith of humanity to work together to address some of the biggest challenges that we have. And that's what I hope we will achieve today. So in closing, let me end where I started by again thanking the Minister for hosting us today, to you and the government. It's a brave government that has a public discussion on debts. And whatever the outcome of these discussions, I think we should applaud you for your efforts on that front. Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your remarks and for helping us understand the World Bank's Sustainable Development Finance Policy. May we now kindly invite the Honorable Minister of State to join us on stage and stand for a group photo with our panelists. Honorable Permanent Secretary, Ms. Kariuki, Mr. Qureshi, panelists, please do join us on stage, as the media are invited to come to the front and take photos. We would also like to invite the chairperson of the NPA to join this photograph.
Watch how I hang with the boys. I'm gonna watch how I raise my voice at you. I'm gonna watch everything I do. This life is worth living. I'm gonna be the man that you've been waiting for. The sign that you've been looking for.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, distinguished panelists, and thanks to members of the audience for their patience. I also hear that our online audience has more than doubled to 200. We welcome our new guests online as well. We have now heard some of the context for Uganda and some numbers for the Eastern and Southern African region. Our keynote speaker today is going to carry that conversation forward. Gibran Qureshi is the head of research for the Africa region at Standard Bank Group. Here he provides operational and strategic leadership to a team spanning the continent. He was twice ranked first in the Financial Mail's Top Analyst Awards for Sub-Saharan Africa and has also been named one of Kenya's top 40 under 40 professionals. Gibran, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Honorable Minister Henry Musasizi, Country Manager for Uganda, Ukami Kariuki, members of the diplomatic community, fellow bankers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The issue with being a keynote speaker, when you have such formidable speakers before you, everything's normally said, you know. So you normally have a lot of echoing of the sentiments that have already been said. I think the speech that we saw from Samuel earlier was, quite apt in regards to capturing a lot of the, the points that I think I want to make. I just realized I forgot my ticker there, so if I could just get it. It's been a while working from home, it's been a long time. What I endeavor to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to perhaps lay the foundation for the panel discussion that we're going to see. And of course, I'm quite excited to hear from the Secretary to the Treasury, Ramadan Gobi. We heard him recently at a Stanbic Bank Uganda Economic Forum speak about the parish development model. And indeed, it's great to see such amazing technocrats at the Ministry of Finance that are, talking about the issues that need to be addressed to restore debt sustainability over the next few years, over the medium term. What I have for you is I have some theater, I have a few slides, and what I've been asked to speak about is the good and the bad of debt. Now, before we go into the context of Uganda, and I am going to use a lot of examples from the other countries in Africa that I cover Zambia, I cover, Ghana, but of course Uganda cannot act like Manchester United and compare themselves to West Ham and Brighton, but we have to, talk about the Liverpool and the Man Cities of this world. Sorry about that, Samuel, sorry. But how do we get here? Now, as you can see from this exhibit, the chart on the left, Africa definitely has a rising investment need, infrastructure. Ever since the Africa Rising narrative that we saw at the conference in Maputo in 2010, 2011, everyone says Africa needs to industrialize. Everyone says Africa has an infrastructure deficit. In fact, the African Development Bank says that Africa's infrastructure deficit is anywhere between $50 to $92 billion, massive. Now, the issue that we have is that we have a very low savings rate, but we have a very high investment appetite. Now, as you can see from this exhibit, the chart on the left, ever since the turn of the century, we've seen on average, despite a bit of a spike in savings rates between 2000 and 2006, and this was an early period where we had financial inclusion, we had commercial banks dropping a lot of minimum deposit rates. It became much easier. Today you can open up a bank account with a national ID. You couldn't do that before. But ever since 2006 all the way to now, as you can see, there's a downward trend in savings. And at the same time, our investment needs are rising. As was mentioned by the previous speakers in the preamble, nearly 50% of Uganda's population is below the age of 15. It's imperative that industrialization takes hold and is maintained to ensure that agriculture, manufacturing, these powerhouse sectors that have the ability to absorb young and semi-skilled labor continue to drive the quest to seek industrialization. But that's why we are where we are. But if you look at emerging Asia, if you look at Southeast Asia, the only reason Southeast Asia today is perhaps the only region that is growing faster than Africa, even prior to the pandemic, is because they did one thing that was majorly different from what we did. They had investment needs, they did industrialize, but they had higher savings rates. And a lot of the financing was attributed to domestic savings. What Africa has done is, because we save too little and invest too much, we've had to attract foreign capital. That's why debt to GDP stocks have gone up. That's why debt service ratios have gone up. Now, I live in Kenya, I'm a Kenyan, and I've been covering African markets for nearly a decade. In 2010 or 2011, when I used to come to Kampala, I used to leave Nairobi. I used to take, if I was lucky, 3 hours from my house to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. I used to land in Entebbe. I used to get to Entebbe. It used to take me, if I was lucky, to Kampala, 2.5 hours maybe. And if I was leaving on a Friday night, Entebbe to Kampala to Entebbe, probably take me 4 hours, if I was lucky. And some of the highlights of my economist career in the last decade has been the border rides that I've taken, stuck in traffic, midway Entebbe to get to the airport. Yesterday, I left Nairobi. I took the Nairobi Expressway. It took me 20 minutes to get to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. I got to Entebbe. I used the Entebbe Expressway. It took me 45 minutes to get to Serena. Massive difference. Now, the reality is that am I thinking as a citizen of East Africa now, or am I thinking as an economist? I've been looking at these projects for such a long time that yesterday when I enjoyed that quick ride to Serena, I started to think about the debt that this has put on the public sector's balance sheet. I started to think about how is government of Kenya, how is government of Uganda finance these projects? Will there be a return on investment? Will there be an equivalent job created? Will there be higher exports as a percentage of GDP? Will there be higher tax as a percent of GDP? Now that's the economist hat that I wear. But of course, as a citizen and a consumer of that road, I love it because I get to my, Serena and the job that I do much quicker. But as you can see, as Uganda, as East Africa, from this exhibit, has invested in infrastructure, we've seen an increase in the public debt stocks over the last decade. Now, what we have to understand is that Uganda is coming from a place where there was HIPC debt relief about 2006, 2007. So even today, when we talk about Uganda's debt to GDP just being shy of 50%, a lot of people remind us that we ought to understand that Uganda came from a period where they got HIPC debt relief, and now debt's growing quite sharply. In fact, if you look at the debt stocks, again, you compare Uganda with Kenya, Kenya just shy of 70% of GDP, Uganda at just shy of 50% of GDP, that stock doesn't look too, it's not massively concerning. But what you have to see is where Uganda has come from in 2010, 2011. You're looking at a pretty sharp, a pretty steep increase in debt to GDP from just, around 20% 10 years ago to nearly 50% 10 years later. And this is after getting HIPC debt relief. Now, the global environment has a lot to do with the changes in the composition of external debt borrowing. As you can see from this chart, ever since the advent of ultra-loose monetary policy in advanced economies, we've seen that as a function of external debt stocks, bilateral and multilateral lending has actually gone down between 2008 and 2018. And what we've actually seen is commercial, non-concessional debt, the likes of the Eurobonds, the likes of the commercial syndicated loans, have actually gone up. And of course, Uganda only recently has also been, taking up a lot of commercial debt. Not a lot, but we'll talk about that as we go on. Now, as you can see from this chart, what we've done is we've charted Uganda's debt composition by bilateral, multilateral, and by private debt. Now, what is interesting here is that the other countries that we cover, for example, the Ghana, the Kenyas, and the Zambias of this world, you'll notice between 2011 and 2012, there's been a steep and a very sharp increase in commercial debt as a function of overall external debt. Now, it can't be a coincidence that a lot of these countries that have fallen into debt sustainability issues, as you know, Ghana is talking about forming creditor committees to restructure external debt. We all know that Ghana, as we speak, is struggling to attract foreign capital because of the rise in Eurobond yields. Now, when you look at Uganda, Uganda's commercial debt, this is what works in favor for Uganda compared to these other countries. At Standard Bank Research, we're not, awfully concerned about Uganda's debt sustainability because we know that the debt stock of Uganda is less commercial than a lot of these other countries that we're a lot more worried about, and some that are already in selective default, like Zambia. If you look at Kenya, 10 years ago, commercial debt, the function of overall external debt, was just about 6%. Now it's just shy of 30%. And as this has happened, we've seen debt stocks become, again, less concessional, more commercial. The repayment period has actually become shorter for infrastructure projects that take longer or medium term to provide return on investments. And that's a central conundrum for every policymaker or every authority in Africa as we speak. On one hand, you need to invest in infrastructure for a young population to spur growth in agriculture, to spur growth in the industrial sector. But on the other hand, you have low savings. So you have to attract foreign capital at a time when there's loose monetary policy in the Western world that is providing you with all this commercial debt. Now, what concerns us is that I think it was, there was a mention by Samuel around the good and the bad of debt. If your debt to GDP is going up and you're investing in infrastructure, your GDP growth is above potential or close to potential. You can argue that a lot of the infrastructure that is being done is positive infrastructure, right? I'm not an engineer, so I can't work out the return on investment on the standard gauge railway in Kenya or the Entebbe Expressway in Uganda. But what I look at is debt service as a percentage of tax, debt service as a percentage of exports. That will give me a good idea whether that debt's productive, whether that debt's good, whether that debt's actually growing the productive capacity of the economy. Now, in countries in East Africa that perhaps are, on a more concerned footing than Uganda, Kenya, for example, you're seeing an increase in debt to GDP. You're seeing growth, just before the pandemic at just below 6%, but you're seeing debt service as a percentage of tax rising exponentially. And in fact, if you look at Kenya's debt service as a percentage of tax, it's close to 30%. So for every, think about it like this, for every 10 shillings, 10 Kenya shillings that the exchequer in Kenya collects, 3 shillings straight away is going towards servicing debt, straight away. The rest will be left for, other productive investments within the economy. And about 5 years ago, if you look at the 2016-2017 fiscal year, this is about 21%. Uganda in this regard, at about 15% currently, is not too concerning, but it's where it's coming from. That's what we have to understand with where Uganda is. And again, the fact that we're having this discussion, shows that there is some, at least political willingness, there's some willingness all around to actually ensure that in 5 years or 10 years from now, Uganda doesn't fall the way of what we've seen with the likes of Ghana, with what we've seen with the likes of Zambia, or doesn't even get close to the worrying levels that we are seeing with Kenya at this point in time. Now, exports. A lot of the classification or reclassification of external debt, as we just heard from the preambles of this conference, Uganda's debt remains sustainable, but it's moved from low distress risk to moderate distress risk. Now, of course, export earnings is a huge sort of equation when it comes to that. And what we've seen over the last, decade or so is that there's generally been low productivity in the coffee sector. And at the outset, I must mention that Uganda's export base does remain relatively well diversified compared to the other markets that we cover for example, the likes of Nigeria, Angola, where these economies are heavily reliant on one commodity to not just drive growth, but also to bring in dollar earnings from exports. So in that regard, Uganda does have a good blend of export drivers. But again, as of 2021, gold and coffee exports accounted for about 39% of goods exports. And we've actually seen a lot of volatility in these $2 earnings within the market. Positively, the coffee sector has been a bright shining light. We've seen a lot of positive strength. Last year, I think it grew by about 39.5%. This year, there's a lot more concern as we go into next year because of the rise in fertilizer prices. And of course, we've also seen a decision by the government to withdraw from the International Coffee Exchange. That still remains to be seen how that would impact, the coffee sector. But of course, when you talk about gold as well, the concentration risk is a bit of a concern because as we know, the tax issues that we saw last year between July and December saw 0 gold exports. And what is interesting and staggering is that between 2010 and 2015, gold exports were just $84 million in Uganda. But between 2016 and 2021, gold exports were $5.4 billion. So that massively helped improve the terms of trade. And these two export earners, which as I mentioned account for 39–40% of exports of goods, are starting to become slightly volatile. Now, the government needs to ensure that there's, again, relentless and incessant efforts to improve agricultural productivity for small-scale coffee farmers, again, to reduce subsistence, to provide the inputs to ensure that production remains quite robust. Now, on the fiscal side, this is quite interesting because a lot of the countries that have fallen into the debt sustainability or debt trap across the African region have consistently had wide fiscal deficits. A confluence of weak revenue mobilization, but also very high development expenditure. Now, in Uganda's case, or rather, not in Uganda's case, but in everyone's case, from the fiscal year 2019-2020, 2020-2021, the impact of the pandemic on public finances was broad-based. We saw that negative impact across the continent. I think it's only Egypt that I cover that had fiscal consolidation during the pandemic, which was astonishing. I don't think there are any other countries that I cover that lowered their fiscal deficit during the pandemic year or the post-pandemic year when we found the vaccine. But what we ought to look at, and what is a bit of a concern, is the fact that Uganda's development absorption for capex, for capital spending, is actually very, very weak. And as you can see from the exhibit on the right, what is actually put in the budget and what is actually spent is normally very different. Uganda normally underspends on the development budget. Now, during discussions we've had with various policymakers over the years, we understand this has to do with a lot of bureaucracy in public procurement. Now, thankfully, the current IMF program that has been in place since last year is seeking to address these bureaucracies in public procurement, and hopefully Uganda can start to spend more, because as we know, the World Bank themselves not too long ago withheld financing from the government of Uganda because the government of Uganda never used to spend what they say they would spend. Now, I mean, some people will say that's a good thing, but of course, when you have a lot of money that's left on the table, that money could potentially be channeled to other non-productive investments within the economy. Now, the reason I show this is, I think this is probably one of the most interesting charts that you can have in a Africa debt discussion right now. And before we talk about this, let's talk about Uganda with regards to Eurobonds. And again, credit where it's due. I've been coming to Uganda for the last 10 years, and every year I would bring asset managers, buy-side accounts, portfolio managers, who would come and do on-the-ground due diligence. And every year when we would come, these investors, across the road at the Ministry of Finance office would beg the Ministry of Finance to issue a Eurobond. Literally would beg the Ministry of Finance to issue a Eurobond. The Ministry of Finance consistently, for nearly 7 or 8 years, has said we're not going to issue a Eurobond, not because we can't, because we don't know what we'll do with that money. Because we can't borrow and leave that money without investable projects. Now, to me, that's a feather in the cap of the government of Uganda. There are very many countries in the last decade, as you saw in my previous slides, who actually happily took that offer for commercial debt like Eurobonds and put that on their balance sheet. The government of Uganda has consistently said we need to find bankable projects to invest before we issue a Eurobond. I think it's highly positive. Now, Ghana's fiscal performance, Ghana has, as you can see, has about 4 Eurobonds. Last year, Ghana announced their budget in the financial year 2022 in December. And their budget was deemed as not credible by market participants. They grew their implied growth in tax revenue by 45%, 45%, when the 5-year pre-pandemic average was 17%. Now, with Eurobond markets, Eurobond investors, they didn't find that budget credible, they didn't find the numbers practical. Ghana's Eurobonds from that time, about 8-9%, the yield went up to currently yesterday 20% and rising. And what that has done, it has put the Ghanaian cedi under pressure because the issuance of Eurobonds would boost foreign exchange reserves. The Ghanaian cedi is one of the worst performing currencies on the African continent year to date, currently just trading shy of 8 against a dollar. And because Eurobond yields have risen, it's basically locked out Ghana of the commercial financing market. And Ghana cannot refinance debt because their risk premium has risen. And that's what it means when you get a Eurobond. When you get a Eurobond, your risk is being priced on a second basis, a second-to-second basis. So if you get a Eurobond and the market doesn't like what we're seeing on the fiscal side, this is a risk that can happen. Now, it doesn't mean that commercial debt is bad. Commercial debt does have its benefits. But I think to understand a country that has taken up so much commercial debt and why they are where they are, this is probably something that even if the Ugandan government wants to issue Eurobonds in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, this should be a case study. This should be a lesson that we should all learn from. Now, we often talk about external debt. We don't talk about domestic debt. Now, domestic debt accounts for roughly, if you split it between external and commercial debt, accounts for about 36.5%. Uganda still pays one of the best real yields on the African continent. As you can see from the chart on the right, the yield curve, Uganda's longer-term bonds are still, in nominal terms, pretty high. But even in real terms, inflation's been quite subdued in Uganda. I mean, of course, it will rise possibly this year because of the supply-side shock that we're seeing from the war in Ukraine. But Uganda has been paying such heavy real yields that I actually think that if you want to have the discussion on debt, you actually even have to think about domestic debt, not just external debt. Now, what is fascinating, and I guess, again, a feather in the cap of the Ministry of Finance in Uganda, also the Bank of Uganda, is that they have consistently, in the last 6 or 7 years, sought to address the reforms that were required to boost financial market foreign investment. So about 5-6 years ago, or even less than that, the Ugandan government reduced the withholding tax on any bond that was 10-year and longer to 10% from 20%. And subsequently, we've seen a lot of foreign portfolio investment from buy-side accounts into that government paper, that government tenor. But of course, I see the Secretary to the Treasury is here, the Honorable Minister is here as well, and maybe a message that I'm opportunistically looking on to pass on here from investors. There's still an element of tax refunds that investors struggle to get back, specifically from the Uganda Revenue Authority. And because that refund takes longer, in fact, there's a backlog from 2016 that is quite large, it's sort of serving as a disincentive to a lot of investors to come into this market. I think if that refund the backlog of those refunds are paid much quicker, and I do understand that there's been some progress on this front in the last 1 year, but if we start looking at the backlog and we start clearing that, I think it will improve credibility to start bringing back a lot more investment. And I think, again, and maybe this is also for the Bank of Uganda, a feather in the cap. They have looked at investors as investors and not speculators. And it also helps that you always have, time. Ugandan technocrats, Ugandan policymakers will always give time to foreign portfolio investors, which you do not see in many of the markets. That's why foreign portfolio investment in Uganda during the pandemic, before the pandemic, has been rising. Now, I think one thing that we probably also ought to mention is that why is Uganda paying such a high real yield? Is it because of the fiscal deficit being quite wide? And it is possibly the case. We do see investors normally concerned about capricious domestic borrowing targets, the large supplementary budgets. So even when they invest in a bond that gives them 10%, if they think that there will be a very large supplementary budget that will take bond yields to 15.5%, they would become a lot more concerned and buy a lot less of that government paper. So again, the fact that Uganda pays such high real yields, when a lot of people have said, should they be paying such high real yields? And that's obviously exacerbating the impact on domestic debt service, I think is a question to ensure that the twin deficits are reined in and you have more predictability on domestic borrowing when it comes to the fiscal side. Now, key lessons from East Africa, the standard gauge railway. And, I'm not saying this because we have the PS in the room and we have the minister in the room. There's a lot of good that has happened in Uganda when it comes to public finance management, when it comes to debt management in the last decade. Ugandan government could easily have gone and said that they want to seek financing for the SGR. The standard gauge railway has not been the most excitable project when it comes to Kenya, because of the fact that there's clearly it was too expensive than it should have been, so the return on investment is taking longer. The Ugandan government was supposed to also put financing for this, but they didn't. What did they say instead? The meter gauge railway. They said, we will rehabilitate the Rift Valley meter gauge railway. Now, if any of you are wondering how I'm a Kenyan, I ended up in Kenya, it's my ancestors who built this, many, many years ago. That's how I ended up in Kenya. And again, the thing is, the Ugandan government could have easily said, we are going to take a $2 billion loan from a certain financing partner, and we're going to build the SGR, which wouldn't make sense because Uganda is landlocked and Kenya wasn't going to connect the SGR to Malaba. But they didn't do that. They actually said, we will rehabilitate the MGR, the meter gauge railway. That again is at least showing some prudency when it comes to the selection of public investment. Now finally, as I wind down, of course, we often talk about the role of PPPs, and sometimes quite loosely. And of course, Uganda's Entebbe Expressway is a PPP project. We've got the Nairobi Expressway, which is also a PPP project. I think it helps. It helps because it reduces public sector balance sheet strain where there's a risk and reward sharing. But again, I think governments need to understand that PPPs are not cheap. They're more efficient, but they're not cheap. And that's where a lot of these issues come through, where we think that we're going to get a PPP, it's going to be less debt, but it's not necessarily less debt. It's less debt spread over, it's more debt, in many cases spread over a longer time. But of course, the efficiency and the execution of that project is actually quite positive. And one thing I'd perhaps like to mention on this aspect is we need the regulatory framework on the PPP side improved. Definitely across Africa, mostly in East Africa. If we want to utilize savings, if we want to utilize domestic savings to invest in infrastructure, we need to ensure that there's a regulation and framework that enables local pension funds, pension managers, to actually enable them to invest in infrastructure as an asset class. But for that to happen, again, there has to be regulatory reform, one, but number two, there has to be a track record to prove to them that investing in infrastructure has a high return on investment, so they will actually find it a compelling opportunity compared to the stocks and the bonds that they traditionally invest in. Now, as I end, what are some of the recommendations and the conclusions that I think are paramount for me to leave you all with today? Now, the first thing that we've talked about is that we have to boost savings. The government of Uganda, many governments in Africa have to think about what Southeast Asia did, what emerging Asia did, is boost savings. We should never be apologetic for investing in infrastructure. We need it. We have a young population. Agriculture, manufacturing needs it. But we have to rethink how we're actually financing it. And then the second recommendation that I'd have is thoroughly assess the quality of investment rather than the quantity of that investment. The National Treasury already, I'm sure, has a public investment efficiency or public investment management unit. And that's, in my view, in the next 5 or 10 years, should be a sort of unit or division within the National Treasury or Ministry of Finance that increases its headcount, that brings in more resource, that brings in more expertise to tell you this is that ROI, this is a project we don't need now, this is a project we can do later. The third aspect that I would recommend is that we often talk about infrastructure and the quality of infrastructure, but today in 2022 in Africa, we need to think about the rates at which we're financing infrastructure, the rates. If we finance infrastructure at exorbitant levels, that return on investment you're thinking about will not transpire, and that will swell your fiscal deficit, that will increase your debt to GDP ratio, and ultimately that project indirectly will be bad for private investment, because to balance the fiscal deficit, taxation will have to be increased arbitrarily in some cases, and that will become counterproductive for private investment and private investors. The next aspect would be, again, something we talked about. The government of Uganda needs to reduce the bureaucracy around procurement. We're hopeful that the IMF program will continue to ensure these reforms happen. We need value addition when it comes to agriculture to provide that buffer to exports. And finally, we need to ensure that there's a more robust and sound regulatory framework when it comes to PPPs. And again, as I leave you for discussion in the plenary session that we're all looking forward to, I'll still say this. Uganda is not at a concerning level. But to echo the sentiments by the previous speakers, it's commendable that you have, the minister sitting here, you have P.S. Gobi sitting there, willing to talk about this. There are many countries that, people are not even allowed to speak about their debt position. So the fact that we're here today, the fact that Uganda is preemptively ensuring that public debt remains on a sustainable path to promote inclusive growth, I think is highly, highly commendable, and I congratulate you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Gibran, for that thorough overview and for giving us a glimpse of the view from your vantage point. Members of the audience, you'll have a chance to ask Gibran questions later, so keep your notes. Equipped with that understanding, let's now move on to our much-awaited panel of experts from across Uganda's debt sphere. We're very pleased to have Paul Bushirizi, senior producer at New Vision, as our moderator. Paul, I turn the floor to you to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you very much, Noriena. As I said, we are having a panel discussion on what's just been discussed and anything else about Uganda, but just a few things before I introduce my panel about Qureshi. I think I can summarize his presentation in the saying that you think your mother cooks the best food until you travel abroad. So us in Uganda, we're here griping and griping and griping, and somebody from outside tells you, you're not doing too badly. It's you can handle it. You can handle it. So it was a bit positive for us. But let's hear from our panelists, many of whom are from Uganda, so they might have an alternative view to the situation. But let me call them up to take their spaces here. First up, of course, the Honorable Ramadan Gobi, our new Secretary to the Treasury. Yes, I also saw Honorable, and I thought, we are saying what's going to happen. We are saying it's coming, it's coming. The Honorable Ramadan Gobi, Secretary to the Treasury, Uganda's Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Of course, he's taught economics for a long time at many universities, most especially Makerere University Business School of Economics, where he also headed a think tank, the MOOBS Economic Forum. His research interests are in industry policy, economic policy, and political economy. Welcome to our panel, Honorable. Mr. Charles Kabiri from Citibank. Please join the Secretary of the Treasury, please. The Vice President and the Head of Banking, Capital Markets and Advisory at Citibank. He's been at Citibank since 2011. Charles has served in several roles, including Senior Relationship Manager and Unit Head for Corporate Banking at that bank. Before that, he was at Standard Chartered Bank and at KPMG East Africa. Then we have Mr. Julius Kapwepwe. Please join our two panelists at the top there, is the Director of Programs at the Uganda Debt Network. He has worked for over 14 years in the area of international development policy and financing. He has also been a scholar under the U.S. International Visitors Leaders Program. He's also currently technical consultant on the government's parish development model. So we're in good hands there. And coordinator for the East African Budget Network. He's also immediate chairperson emeritus at the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group. Last but not least, and interestingly, the only non-Ugandan on the panel, Mr. Samuel Mayumbo. Of course, we've heard from him previously, a director from Development Finance, or for Development Finance at the World Bank, and focused on resource mobilization for the International Development Association. In this role, he is responsible for the implementation of IDA's hybrid financial model. Before joining the World Bank, Samuel was bank inspector at the Bank of Zambia and an auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers. A round of applause for our panel of... So just a bit of background to our discussion. Of course, you've heard from previous speakers about the situation. Oh, but first of all, of course, Paul Busharizi, senior producer at the Vision Group. So we're going to today's discussion, and it's titled, as we know, Managing the Good and the Bad, Uganda's Debt Sustainability. Managing the Good and the Bad, Uganda's debt sustainability. It's a timely subject, of course, as has been shown, especially since we're coming out of the COVID situation where we suffered lockdowns, border closures, and economic disruptions. It's a sensitive time, but a sensitive time in our part of the economy. Of course, it's even made worse with the war in Ukraine, which is threatening to weaken recovery efforts and also increase prices. On the back of these and more recent events, Uganda is seated on a host of other fundamental developmental challenges. To mention just three of them, we have a fast-growing population, among the fastest in the world, which is putting pressure on delivery of services and needs, and it's urgent that we create jobs to ensure the welfare of this young population, as was stated earlier. Secondly, we have a high infrastructure deficit. We have less infrastructure than we need to pursue our development ambitions. And then there's a low productivity in our key economic activities. Those are the challenges that face us today in trying to turn around this economy, and what makes debt discussion very important, especially, as was said earlier, that our savings rate is particularly anemic. So, here to help us break down these things, these issues for us, and probably light a way forward for us going into the future are our panelists, as I said earlier, Ramadan Gobi, Charles Kabiri, Julius Kapwepe, and Samuel Mayumbo. So the goal today is to discuss ways of addressing Uganda's debt vulnerabilities, as we've heard already, with the end goal of building a strong foundation for growth and prosperity. Of course, to be amiss again, not to thank the Honorable SST who is in the House and the Minister for being with us. It's always good when the people who can take actions are here to, to listen and probably take in something and go with it. Get a feel of what the ground is speaking, talking about. So also our keynote address speaker is still here, Mr. Qureshi, and he'll actually take the seat that was supposed to be mine when it comes to question time. I think it's more convenient for me to sit here. I can see all of you. If I was there, I'd be craning my neck, and age might not favor me in that direction. So let's kick off this discussion, and I'm going to start with Mr. Gobi. I call him Mr. Gobi. In the previous time, I would just call him Ramadan, but now I have to observe protocol. He's Mr. Gobi to all of us. In a previous life, I would call him just Ramadan, but Mr. Gobi. Could you elaborate on some of the actions that we have already heard about, especially in addressing the issue of our debt sustainability?
Thank must protect my friends from flu, but not from COVID. I thank you, Honorable Minister of the World Bank, and all the good people in the room. I can see so many of them from both the government and private sector, but also from our diplomatic corps. On the issue of managing our debt in Uganda, as a government, we've done a number of reforms, we've done a number of things. And the first one, you see these mics were made for small people. So I was saying, first of all, as a country, our overall fiscal strategy was designed in such a way that we manage debt and also make it as transparent as possible and ensure that it is sustainable. That strategy is intended to promote inclusive growth. We want to make a growth inclusive so that all our efforts as government go towards improving the incomes of our people, the household incomes, right from our National Development Plan 3, which is anchored on this objective, to the several policy interventions through the budget. We are looking at how to get the quality of life of Ugandans improve, but without compromising our debt sustainability. So we can't bore ourselves to the danger zone simply because we want to get money to do certain things. So debt has the first call on whatever we are doing, but the strategy is very elaborate. Secondly, we have the domestic revenue mobilization strategy we are all aware of, and we have been speaking about it. Now our main focus is on implementation of this domestic revenue mobilization strategy. My minister, who has spoken to you today, his number one task in the ministry is to coordinate us to implement this strategy going forward. And as we have already indicated in the budget strategy for next year, he has already aligned all of us to achieve 0.5% increase on our debt to GDP ratio every single year. So about 5 or so years from today, we shall be somewhere near our peers in a domestic revenue mobilization so that we reduce over-reliance on debt. We also have...
I think you meant tax to GDP ratio, increasing it 0.5. You said debt to GDP.
Oh, tax to GDP, I beg your pardon. Tax to GDP ratio. Thank you for that correction. The tax to GDP ratio of Uganda has been one of the low ones in the region. We want to raise it every year by 0.5% so that we can catch up with the peers. And we have the strategy, the team, and the leadership to achieve this. Number 3, we have also developed a medium-term debt management strategy. This one, we do it every single year. Medium-term debt management strategy. The intention here is to manage the cost of debt and its associated risks, so that we borrow when we have the detail of what we are trying to do in terms of the costs and risks associated with our debt portfolio. The fourth one we have done, we have put in place a public investment financing strategy. Public investment financing strategy. And here we want to align our financing options to the appropriate government programs so that we can be able to achieve value for money in our investments, and also ensure longer term fiscal sustainability. This strategy has been finalized. It is undergoing the final stages of approval, and we shall be publishing it in the due course for everybody to see. That's how transparent we are. Everything is up there on the website about Uganda. Lastly, we have also carried out project review. We have reviewed our project portfolio to identify those projects which are not likely to add value to our lives, much as we already contracted them, and be able to either restructure them or renegotiate them or cancel them. We pay some money, but we get them out of the way, because we have had some projects which are not performing, and these have also been constraining us in terms of our fiscal space. You have to borrow over and above the numbers which you would have managed, simply because some projects are holding the fiscal space. We have already profiled these projects, we have analyzed them, and we have even had conversations with our bosses, the legislators, the budget committee, the national economy committee, and we want to accelerate it and be able to get them out of the way. So I could say those are some of the things we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Gobi, but I wanted to just stick with you a bit. You talked about inclusive growth as at the top of your talk. What are the interventions that you see creating this inclusive growth? I mean, I know you've been a big critic of jobless growth before you came into office. Now you're in the hot seat. What are these things that you think will create inclusive growth?
Okay, the seat is not so hot. It can even rotate. The first thing we've done, beginning next financial year, we have taken resources to people who rarely see resources from government going to them. The parish development model is intended to accelerate what we call financial inclusion. You know, there are two opportunity equalizers in life. I've said this and this again. When you give them to the people, people will always transform their lives. And number one is education. Number two is financial inclusion. Any person anywhere on this planet who's educated and has access to affordable, patient finance, they are living good lives. Those who don't choose not to. So in Uganda, we've now taken deliberate steps to have Ugandans, first of all, have education. And in the coming budget, for example, the first item on top of that budget, which we have allocated over 9 trillion shillings, is human capital development. and it is going to take 28.4% of the budget. And human capital development is about education and health, as well as water for human consumption. Then we have allocated ₦1 trillion and some 59 billion on top of the trillion to go to the people at the lowest unit government can reach, and that's the parish. And this money is earmarked for investment in agro-related businesses. This, we hope, is going within the medium term to be able to improve financial inclusion, because these people, all the people who are seated in the room here who are lending money, they don't want to lend to them. They call them risky. And indeed they are risky. They are not traceable. Even as government, we are struggling to trace them. They are not very easy to monitor. And also, you don't have any guarantee that they will put the money to the proper use to which they have applied it for. But as government, we have said, let's go and integrate them in the economy. Hence that theme which my minister read out, the full monetization. So that's where the inclusive growth is anchored.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we shall have questions from the audience on that much later on. But let me move along, and I come to you, Sam. As you mentioned earlier, the bank started implementing the Sustainable Development Finance Policy in July 2020. What are some highlights from this journey to incentivize sustainable debt? Maybe you can start by briefly telling us what it is to begin with, and then the incentives.
Sure, I'm happy to. And clearly this mic was meant for people like me, so I'm comfortable with this. I think the key thing about the Sustainable Development Finance Policy is its ability to link development to debt, and to say to countries, as the minister, as the PS has rightly pointed out just now, in that when it comes to matters of debt, how you prioritize your investment, what instruments you choose, the financing terms you apply are all highly relevant. And if Gibran was here, I would gladly trade seats with him right now, because one of the key elements of the policy is actually about transparency. And I think that's a very powerful instrument. There was one slide that he presented about the composition, the difference in composition of debt. How, the proportion of your private sector debt compared to your multilateral debt and bilateral debt has a huge bearing on your ability to afford that debt. A lot of the countries, had this policy been in place a few years ago, may not have ended up where they were, because the pressure to be more transparent than they were would have been much higher. And so if I was to pick out, a single most significant element of this policy, is the fact that it is legislating the publication of debt in more ways than we have done in the past. So when I think about the first year of implementation and the policy performance actions that we have seen in Lesotho, in Zambia, and a number of other countries, that is actually legislating the volume of debt, the details of debt. That in itself, I know sometimes, even as we implement the policy, and many of you will have the conversation, even with my own colleagues, that they'll say, publication of the debt report, is that really enough? Yes, thank you. Publication of a debt report, is that really enough? And I'd like to remind people that it's not just the mere act of publishing the report that matters. It's actually the conversation that goes into that publication, identifying what items to publish, deciding what level of detail. An area that we are finding is producing some really interesting conversation is about publishing state-owned enterprise debt. Because when you have that conversation, for the first time you're having state-owned enterprise CEOs who previously thought that they had liberty in terms of structuring their balance sheet, realize that, hang on a second, this has implications on the sovereign debt. So that is one element of the policy that is really key for me. The second element is about the link with fiscal sustainability. And that link is one of the areas when it comes to policy performance actions that links it to the revenue side. Whether it is VAT reform, whether it is taxation, and all of those elements which traditionally in a debt-focused conversation may fall by the wayside. But lastly, let me also end on where I concluded in my opening remarks, that issues of debt will take a village. It is not enough to simply put good intentions on the table about how you manage your fiscal responsibility. It's about putting in place the mechanisms that will monitor implementation, that will identify the right people to implement. And so I'm very pleased to hear about the push to make sure that the resources are going to the lowest level of organization in the country, as we've heard here. Because at that level, the link between resource and benefit when it comes to education, when it comes to health, is direct. In an environment where you have large informal sectors, making that link is difficult, but it's important. And that's where I think the policy has some leg and some room to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Let me come to Charles from Citibank. I was teasing him earlier in the morning that isn't the easiest banking job. They have only one branch, and they don't cater to, my words, not his, they don't cater to the unwashed masses. And Gobi says, untraceable people. But Charles, you are our private sector person in the room, on the stage. From your vantage point, what do you see as the main challenges and opportunities for Uganda to borrow at lower cost while managing risk?
Thanks, Paul. First of all, I would like to debunk that myth. We actually participate in the wider sector, but we can have another discussion through our existing clients and so forth, but we can have a wider discussion. To look at the issue of cost of borrowing for the country would, like Gibran earlier indicated, is that we would separate the domestic debt and also external debt. For the domestic debt, our real yields have traditionally been very wide. I mean, we've had instances where our inflation has been low, stable currency, but the yields we get on the domestic debt are very wide. And this is mainly because we haven't attracted foreign portfolio flows in the country. Certainly this has started improving over the last few, probably 18 to 24 months. The yields have been tightening as we attract more foreign players, but also the government has also realized that they need to reduce the domestic borrowing to some extent so that they can be able to get tighter pricing. On the external debt, the traditionally we have benefited from concessional borrowing, which has sort of had our weighted average cost of borrowing low compared to our peers. But as we transition to the middle income status country, that concessional borrowing is certainly going to dry up, and we have seen it starting to dry up. And we inevitably have to access other financing mechanisms such as commercial debt. But one way to benefit from tighter pricing in commercial debt is that, one, we have to run an extremely healthy public financing and also efficiency. We need to certainly invest or spend in the sectors that we have said we are going to spend in. If some countries very well, if we say we are spending on access to water, we need to after probably the investment period, we need to justify, or we need to indicate that we have achieved access to water. Secondly, a lot of commercial lenders out there prefer project-specific borrowings. They are not interested in financing, in budget support. They will, but they are not interested because they want to see that what we are spending on is specific, their outcomes, and this can be measured. Some of them actually employ third-party companies to come and measure that impact. Certainly, one other way of reducing the cost is through credit enhancements. We have seen this through access to DFIs, some credit enhancements like insurance and so forth. That's one other way we can reduce the cost of borrowing, and also access to multilateral and donor support, which we have done over the past few years. And then government has been doing this, accessing alternative financing mechanisms such as the ECAs. Gibran talked earlier on about the PPPs, and the beauty with this is that they are specific to a project, so it's easier to measure the outcomes, and investors out there, you crowd in pools of capital for people to be able to, for investors to be able to participate. Of course, if we are an investment grade country, we would also benefit from the market, from the debt market, because the yields are tighter there. But there is a lot more work that needs to be done over multiple years to achieve the investment grade status.
Sorry, just that last part. Yeah. Run us through what we need to do over the next few years to achieve to investment grade status.
There are a lot of things, including some of the points that the PS has indicated in terms of positioning ourselves from a public finance management perspective. There is the politics. There are a lot of factors involved in putting yourself as an investment grade. For comparison purposes, there are not very many countries in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa who are investment grade. So what happens is that we normally, for lack of another word, we are considered junk status, not in the actual sense, but we are considered junk status. We are not investment grade. There are far many more things that need to be done to become an investment grade and achieve tighter spreads in the cost of. No, we are not. No, it's either investment grade or non-investment grade. Yeah.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Charles, for that. Let me come to Julius eventually. We've had this discussion many times, Julius. Having listened to all the other people before you, in your opinion, what should be the priority actions for the country to prudently support public resource management and ensure short and long-term growth? I know you have.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. And as my earlier speakers said, all protocol observed, but we thank you, Honorable Minister, that you are amidst us. We don't take it for granted. We thank you that the World Bank group fraternity is with us. We don't take it for granted either. And all of you distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I think number 2 for me is to recognize that, just taking one particular case, that the World Bank, for instance, has been with us as a country and also as a region. If you took a case of the East African Community region, from our pre-independence days to date. And I think that such a person or such an institution is a friend who you are free to clap for them. Why? Because the extent of investment, for instance, in the road sector, in energy, we are talking about the numbers of literacy earlier on in this country. The World Bank has been part of that discussion, that good dividend to that extent. And I think for me, then it is mainly about how do we expand our legroom for our fiscal ambitions. It is not so much about this time, about the lamentations, or the other sharing has not taken this other route, but mainly how do we, and that's where quickly I would wish to come in from. And I think one of the first areas for consideration, for instance, is what I have put down here, and I've called it targeted, I'll read it verbatim, targeted market segmented investment in Uganda's production and export capacities. We cannot continue to talk about the level of potential we have if we invested in our aluminium industry as an example. If you looked at the opportunities that we have in the Chijezi and in the Nkore areas, for instance. So I think for me that kind of opportunity invites both government and the private sector creditors to co-invest, therefore forge a formidable partnership. We can always discuss the details at another level. But in principle, then we are able to take advantage of that kind of opportunity that aluminium would give us, aluminium and aluminium products would give us. If you looked at the East African community, if you looked at market opportunities in Chad, Somalia, and many of these areas surrounding us. The other bit in that segmented marketing would also be to create the necessary infrastructure again. If you looked at earlier on, for instance, we talked about the standard gauge railway. Arguably, we can have issues, pros and cons around it, but in principle, I see it as a huge opportunity when you look at the kind of investments that are happening around in the continent, even in the East African community. It is mainly Uganda that is being left behind. Yet Uganda is likely to be the land bridge of this region. So I think for me, having a level of government rather than go it alone, bringing aboard certain shareholders, investors, corporations, and individuals would be able to have that ambition kick-started. And with that, then you can have the level, perhaps a reduced level or maintained level of maintenance in the road sector, as we are saying, where every time you are just investing in the road sector, but in terms of getting the actual dividend and the alternatives that would save us the level of huge investment, for instance, in the road sector, by investing in the waterways and railways, would be one of the areas that as investors would come in, and then we are able to see more opportunities, more revenues, more trade in the region, intra and inter, and then we are able to register. Another one quickly for me is an aspect of, I have seen those who are convinced about investment in fish more. I've not seen fish more personally, Ndugu Busharizi, but looking at the figures, it appears investment in fish farming would be one of the key and quicker revenue potentials over the medium term for a country like Uganda with the adverse opportunities that we have. So the private sector creditors, I think, will need to come and co-invest with us as a people, as a country, as a government, and then we are able to see those expanded potentials for avenues into our fiscal ambitions. And maybe the aspect also of when you look at the securities market, for instance, talking about the domestic debt aspect, from the perspective of Uganda Debt Network and other Ugandans, we seem to see that its attractiveness, the attractiveness of the securities market, for instance, continues to create increasingly a level, a scale of lazy investors. Lazy investors, of course, in quotes, but that rather than this money holder to make effort into having a factory and get the returns that would come thereof, but the multiplier effect equally that would come as a result of somebody trying to make money by establishing a factory simply goes and buys the government paper and goes for her golf. Not that I have any issue with golf at all, but many other things. So that crop of lazy investors, I think we will need to find a way as a country of how do we provide for certain monetary instruments that would not increase that class of investment, but rather that it can encourage people with the money available to invest into productive sectors. Because then it is out of that we are able to get a dividend, to get a level of revenue that we want. And I think lastly for me for now, as a country, thanks to the World Bank and many of you distinguished ladies and gentlemen in this room and those outside, we have invested in flagship sectors. If you looked at energy, if you looked at roads again, as a case. And that is very good. So that level of stock of good investment is saying, I think it is time that it should be saying that please utilize me so that you are able to maximize utility out of that kind of investment. In other words, if I have a Kapchorwa up to Swam Bridge kind of road into Kitale in Kenya, how much of the attendant investment are we doing so that we can maximize the existence of such a facility? A wheat processing or project investment by us as government and other Ugandans, but also the private sector, would be able to maximize the wheat production capacity in the Kapchorwa Sebei areas, and then we can utilize that road as we go into the market. I think for now, for me, those are some of the areas that we would be beginning to look at more cautiously. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. Clearly, you don't play golf, but hopefully people shall inculcate you in that tradition and you'll stop having such a vast feelings about golfers and golfing. But there's been a change of schedule for the panelists. We have to kind of cut it short. But just last remarks. But I'd like maybe each of you, if you could speak to something Mr. Qureshi pointed out about our savings, our low savings rates versus the need for more investment. How can we actively push up these savings rates? Because even in Asia, it was not by mistake that their savings rates are so high. I think we'll go first with Mr. Gobi.
Thank you, Paul. You know, Gobi, these days, listen to what others say so that you can do those things, implement them. Those others which I know should be done, I communicate them through policy. So I'll listen to my colleagues, because I had already noted actually the how. Because everybody is saying we need to raise our domestic savings rate, but the big question is how. What exactly needs to be done to make Ugandans save, to make Ugandans stop discounting the future so heavily, that the future is too far. Let me enjoy. Life is short. You know, those are some of the things I usually hear people say. But I would like to tell you what perhaps we are doing in ensuring that very, very quickly that our fiscal space is also well managed, so that we don't put a lot of pressure on Ugandans in terms of overtaxing them and also in borrowing. We have now strategized to invest in those projects or sectors which are going to add value very quickly to our lives and also accelerate the growth of the economy. We are prioritizing oil and gas sector to get these oil resources which we have been anticipating for many years, so that we can be able to get some revenue and use it to invest in other livelihood projects especially. We are also prioritizing finalization of key infrastructure projects. The priority now is mainly on those infrastructure projects we have started, other than getting new ones. I'm talking of those in the energy sector, the Karuma Dam, the transmission lines, so that that word called deemed energy gets out of my budget. We are talking about the substation is in industrial parks, the other infrastructure there. We are prioritizing it. But also, we want to create some jobs. So we are prioritizing the export-free zones, industrial parks, so that these younger people, you know, Uganda have a challenge that many younger people who are tweeting and updating Facebook, they are really frustrated because the level of employment, both in terms of the job, but also in terms of the earnings from the job, they are very low. So we need to accelerate those. And lastly, we are also trying to deliberately improving access to credit, because somebody may walk out of this room thinking finance is only talking about parish development model. That's the no. Our strategy is to have a package for every category of people. We have one for micro businesses. We have put it in place, and it is working very well in helping those who are working in the markets, in the informal settings and so on. You have heard of Emioga. Some people, when that word started a few months ago, years ago, they used to ridicule, Emioga, what are you talking about? Now, Emioga have kept, especially women-owned businesses, youth, and other people in the informal sector afloat, despite the COVID-19. We have also for smaller businesses. Those are now formalized. We put in place a small business recovery fund, which is being administered by Bank of Uganda through commercial banks. Uptake has been somewhat low, and recently I tasked the bank, the central bank, and my people to look into ways of ensuring that this fund benefits the intended people, and also quite efficiently. We have also a package for medium and large businesses, which we pass through the Uganda Development Bank and also from Uganda Development Corporation. For UDB, it is debt. For UDC, it is equity. Those businesses which used to come to government and say, bail me out, I'm very strategic. Now the bailout is through co-investment with the UDC, because these are taxpayers' money. We don't just throw it around as grant, and it is helping us to keep some businesses afloat. And recently, the World Bank, the great friends of World Bank, always come to their friends at a point of need. They gave us a wonderful project called Invite. We are going to invest money now in industrial parks, improving infrastructure, but most importantly in SMEs, so that we can support them to recover and also to export. This is mainly having an export discipline in it. So we hope, and very hopeful, that with now all the segments of Ugandans covered, and complementing what the commercial banks and other financial institutions have been doing, and they are continuing doing, and I call upon all Ugandans to understand the significance of having this complementarity, not competing. And in the government itself, I'm fighting with some of my people to understand this, that commercial banks are as important as our own efforts. It's a full package when you You start saying this or the other, you are in trouble. You can't develop the economy. So I wanted to say that before I hear about the savings, and then I'll implement what people tell me if it is practical. Thank you.
Okay, let me pass it on to Sam. You might have experience from around the countries you manage. How do they deliberately increase? That's part of your final parting words.
Okay.
How do you see this happening?
Thank you very much. I mean, look, savings is a long-term game. That starts very young, starts with working on people's psyche and approach. And when the PS was saying, you know, life is short, enjoy it now, I realized that we are all Ugandans on this stage today. I could be on a panel in Zambia and have the same challenge. These things take time. But it's important, as you heard from Gibran this morning, that the difference you can make when you use your own savings is significant. So it's about financial literacy starting young. It's about schools. It's about making sure that people are aware of the different financing instruments. It's about working with employers, working with governments to put the mechanisms in place. It's working at local government, it's working with communities and all of those. And unfortunately, sometimes when people start talking about these initiatives, they sound too small, and therefore they want to look for that big thing. But anybody who looks at the miracle of East Asia will realize that a lot of these initiatives were actually at the household level. So that work must go on. It will take place in the shadows. You will not get the credit you deserve for many years, but it will pay off in the long run. In terms of closing remarks on my part, I mean, I think one thing that I certainly want to leave you with is the notion that this is going to take a lot of people working together, both within the country and internationally as well. And I certainly would like to welcome you to think about the World Bank not as this foreign institution that's way up there, right? This is your institution. It is staffed by Zambians, by Kenyans like Mukami. It's staffed by Ugandans. Our chief legal counsel for the Africa region, Sheila Braka, is a Ugandan. This is your institution. And so to the extent that we can continue to have these frank and open conversations, we will learn, we will share, we will bring whatever expertise we have, we will take whatever expertise we have from here. And certainly listening to this panel, there is much that my colleagues and I will take away from this as we go to the next country and continue to have this conversation. So with that, I really want to thank each one of my fellow panelists for their very candid view, for candidly sharing their views. Even our banker here, I'll forgive him for being a banker, but let's keep our banks close to our heart. I started my life as a regulator, and the PS is absolutely right. This takes everybody. It takes public financing, it takes private sector financing. It's a package, and we should look at it in its totality in order for us to make a difference. So with those remarks, thank you very much for having me on this panel as an honorary Ugandan this morning.
You're welcome. I think there's enough space for more of us. But Charles, your final thoughts as well, especially speaking to how do we mobilize savings deliberately?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. In addition to what Sam has indicated is that there is also need. It's not about raising savings, but we need the savings to be utilized for investments. There is probably a need for some regulatory reform. That's already happening, it's in progress, but probably to fast track it. We all know that the biggest pension fund, NSSF, is a force to reckon in the region with assets of north of 15 trillion. That money can be accessed and used for projects or for government financing. And that also needs to be done for other pension funds. The smaller pension funds, probably regulation needs to come in place. People can save on their own, but most times, like for NSSF, my employer puts in 15% in there. Automatically, there is money which is raised there. The culture bit, as indicated, will take long, but we have been talking about the national health insurance scheme. although it's not yet in operation, but probably it's a way we can start raising financing for the health sector in the future. As my closing remarks, I wanted to add that as lenders, commercial lenders specifically, disclosure is very, very important. The government is doing quite a bit. We get access to the debt statistics, but it's very important for us to know at the beginning of the year what projects were done the prior year, what projects are they prioritizing in the next fiscal year. And if I give an example of the government of Benin issued an ESG bond last year, they also put in place a framework whereby the projects that qualify to be financed under that ESG bond are known. Everyone knows them, the measurement criteria is there, and everyone knows the measurement criteria. Out there is something they call data for dollars. The more data you provide, the more dollars you can attract, and with tighter pricing.
Thank you, Charles. And I think I want to come and work at Citibank, where they contribute 15% to NSSF on my behalf. Where I work, I put in 5%, and the company puts in 10%. But it seems Citibank, it's a different business. Julius, your final comments, but also on how can we raise our savings rates deliberately?
Thank you. And I like when you say deliberately, consciously, as Karl Marx says. For me, quickly, I look at an example, for instance, of the initial public offers time at Stanbic and how much of a subscription there was. That's an extent of money had to be returned to corporations and to individuals. So rather than government, for instance, go it alone in some of these investments, please float an extent of shares. We can always discuss the details, and we are able to bring in our money as corporations and individuals, and we are able to take off on some of these investments as we also make a saving. I think also, quickly, Ndugu Gobi, I think looking at the level, say, of immunization, the level of increased security in the country, to say that you are just enjoying today because tomorrow you are dying, and we are saying the number, for instance, the numbers under SAGE increasing, I think would be to misread a bit of the future. You may be here longer than you think. Therefore, one of the other ways for me is to, even when you look at, say, the NSSF, can we expand consciously the number of subscribers and contributors therefore than those that are elusive? And lastly, for me, I think we could leverage on the parish development model. We can agree and disagree on the details, but in the principle, one of the key aspects it has talked about is savings. Hitherto, you get a bit of government grant, but going forward, you're expected to have your level of savings, and consolidating those different types of avenues could be able definitely to contribute us towards the promised land. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. So that brings us to the end of the panel discussion, but the audience still have questions for you, I assume. And with that, we wanted to ask Qureshi to come and probably join the panel up here, because they might have questions for you as well. So we want to keep it short and tight. Please, first of all, a round of applause for our panelists. The issues of development, you can talk about them till the cows come home, but for this teaser, for now, probably we'll meet them later and ask them further questions, but we're going to the question and answer session now. We request that we're going to do like a round of questions, about 5. Somebody who stands up to that microphone and asks a question. We ask you to please state your name and your organization before tabling your question. If you're tuning in virtually, please put your question in the chat or comments and we'll read them out later. But so let's kick off with the first 5 questions. There's one here, there's a gentleman there, and a lady there. Question? There's a gentleman here, so there are 4. I need one more. I'm going to balance it, so the lady And then that's the first round.
Thank you very much, Moderator. Pamela Mbabazi, Chairperson, National Planning Authority. I want to thank the Ministry and the World Bank for putting together this very insightful discussion. I think I have been educated today, and I really liked the fact that one of the elements that was stressed today is that we need to have very honest, very candid, very clear conversations on what actually works and what hasn't worked and what we need to do to get it right. So I'll really hit the point straight, and I have had very clearly, and for me as a planner, I really want to be helped as we really think out of COVID, what is it we can do to really turn our countries around? And for me, I think we still have a very huge infrastructure deficit that we must address. We have no option. And I've heard you very loud and clear. In order for us to lower the costs of production and make Uganda that attractive destination for investment, we cannot fail to address the infrastructure deficit. Now, I've heard you loud and clear. We don't have many options. Now, given that the terms of borrowing are becoming more stringent, and I hear you, the debt stock is increasing, and I want you to help me. What are the options we have? In our NDP3, we put green financing. We did put diasporic bonds. We did put infrastructure bonds. What are options? I just want to get that clarity, and I've heard you. I thank you.
Paul, with your permission, I'm going to read a question that came in online, which is actually a very important one. How can everyone in the room today, all the stakeholders here, help ensure better debt transparency, which is important to sustainable debt? And we're ready for our next question now.
Okay, there was the gentleman, I think. Yes. Oh yeah, you're next. Yes, I haven't forgotten.
But your method might scare some people from asking. Why don't they take the mics to them?
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you. I'm David Bazwane from Trademark East Africa. That is a trade for growth, trade for wealth development partner to government of Uganda. My question goes to the PSST. There has been a moratorium on sovereign loan guarantees. In your view, should they be removed or should they be tightened? On sovereign guarantees, sovereign loan guarantees, should they, in your view, should they be tightened further? Then another one to Mr. Maimbo. What is the carrot and stick? It may be obvious, but what's the additional carrot and stick for this new policy? Thank you. Carrot, the additional carrot and stick for the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Dr. Agnes Atimapea, Member of Parliament, very interested in the political economy discussion. And as a politician, I see this making a lot of sense here, but in our space, we have a different view. And so I want to thank very much, particularly our PST, for a very elaborate position, and all the presenters that is giving our country hope in as far as debt is concerned. However, I have two issues. One, which has been raised very critically on the cost of borrowing. And in my view, this is a critical element in our discussion today in terms of sustainable financing. I have read in the 2021-2022 report of the Ministry of Finance on the public debt and grants and financial liability. And one of the things that is coming out very clearly is that as a country, which seems to be running more to the commercial banks, whose interest rates are very high, leaving the concessional kind of loans. I would really want to hear why is that, and how safe are we as we talk about sustainable financing. The second issue that is also coming out from this same report is on the hand-disbursed loans. And as a country and a politician, we are very cognizant of the issue of the absorption and implementation of our ministries, departments, and agencies. In fact, the percentage is very alarming, 66% as of December 2021 on undisbursed loans. And as an ordinary citizen, when you sign a loan, you're already committed, and yet this loan is not disbursed. What is it that we can do as a country so that we don't go for what we are not ready for? And finally, on the issue of prioritization and borrowing on projects that has returns on investment as quick as possible. And I've had my PSST's opinion or views on investing in agriculture, but that we shall talk on it on another day. I've seen your prioritization on oil, infrastructure, industrial parks, which are really very good kind of strategy. And my sister, Professor Pamela, has also added on, of course, the key infrastructure deficit that we have as a country. But having a country of 70% in agriculture and being a member of parliament of a very rural district in Amolatar, deep in northern Uganda, and I don't hear you coming out very clearly on strategic intervention on making our people productive. Although I know that the investment on PDM is to increase production and productivity, but I seem not to hear that strategic kind of investment from now the marketing aspect of it and the value addition. And I always hear most of our banks here looking at some of those investments as really very high-risk investments. Can I have more light on that? I thank you very much.
Clearly, Mr. Gobi, the seat is hot. You hadn't realized.
Well, my name is Shama Muchibi. I'm an investigative journalist with Gugude TV. My question will go to direct to Mr. Ramathan. I'm interested to know, Uganda is one of the countries that have good policies, but we still have a very big challenge when it comes to implementation. My interest is with the PDM. We've had so many good programs. We can mention Ntandi Kwabo, Nabagagawale, Emyoga, and all that you've even mentioned about here. But we have a challenge of administrative costs. At a time when we have 1 trillion plus allocated to this particular program, we've always had challenges with administrative costs that you may find that half of this money goes to administrative costs. What is the hope that you're giving Ugandans that this time around, this money won't go into administrative costs, that it will benefit the layperson, the common person to which it is intended, to the parishes? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So after that round of questions, we're coming back to the panelists. I suspect that Mr. Gobi is fielding most of the questions. So I shall sit there. You've become a very elusive character these days, so now they've found you. Now, it's your turn. Go, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a full basket on the moratorium on sovereign guarantees. Is it about to get lifted, or if I had a way, I would not only keep this moratorium, I would lock it up somewhere, and I throw the keys in Lake Victoria. But I don't have that way, so that we shall continue with that conversation. Let's engage. Actually, you come and we talk about this. I will give you some good time. We speak about this and you tell me the issues and how we should address them. But there are certain things I don't, in finance we don't want to, we are allergic to. One is guarantee, another one is called Eurobonds. When you say Eurobonds, I always tell my chief borrower, she's here with her team, there are certain words when you say them, right away you switch off. And you talk, when you finish, then we talk about other things. So those guarantees, and because they have inherent kind of challenges. But we can have a conversation. Now I will open up and we discuss. On the cost of borrowing, the Honorable Member of Parliament, she used to be my good friend when we were still in those days. These days she's very tough on me, and that is good. The commercial debt versus concessional. These conversations, ma'am, we are having them also amongst ourselves, and as a ministry we've aligned our strategy to attracting as much concessional debt as it is available. And we only go commercial when Parliament and the other quarters lead us there in ways which I don't want to talk about. But commercial debt, we are very mindful of its impact on getting our debt levels shoot up, and the sustainability issues. And in most cases when we are seated and discussing these things, these come up, and we have that commitment to pursue. My people in debt, whenever now they are looking out for any financing, the first major precondition they give is the concessionality of the financing itself. We borrow longer term. We prefer to borrow longer term, and also at concessional rates. But there is that thing called budget support, which I have asked my people whether it is still relevant to be in my budget lines, budget support, because it has been attracting to help me finance the budget. It's usually commercial, but we want to bring it down as much as possible, and definitely we shall rely on your support as legislators to ensure that we do this. We are very committed. On the undisbursed loans, you are 100% correct, and because it brings us these issues of paying commitment fees, which I presume nobody would want to pay, because we have borrowed money but we can't disburse it, and we committed. We are working on it to minimize it, and we are doing this by, number one, ensuring that we contract debt only for ready projects, and we've started a very good journey on this trend. You can no longer bring projects to finance to get them funded or financed when they are not ready. They have to be first studied. We have put it as a policy measure. No project in the budget when it's not yet ready. Even those which are already in the budget, some of which were affected mainly by the COVID pandemic. These last 2 years also you need to be mindful that they have been extraordinary years. Some of the agencies failed to use the money, and we have them. I actually told Parliament in this very budget of 2022-23 we are going to approve, to implement. There is a total of 94 projects which were supposed to exit this year. They are supposed to exit by June, but we are going to implement them in the coming year's budget. They were extended mainly because of COVID-19 and other challenges, though, some of them which we know, the inherent weaknesses we are trying to deal with. So those ones, we are going to try and ensure that they get out of the way, and we disburse the money. Making Ugandans productive, of course, Honorable, we have invested 1.4 trillion in agro-industrialization as a program in the next year's budget. On that, add the 1.059 trillion for the parish model, which itself is earmarked for purchasing inputs for agriculture. That is now literally 2.5 trillion shillings going into agro-industrialization area. Of course, the targeting is usually the challenge in terms of how do you deploy this money, especially along with the value chain. And we are currently working with the Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries, Ministry of Trade as well as Ministry of Water and Environment, to ensure that going forward we put in place enough safeguards against doing the things the same way we have been doing them, and we expect the same results. So we are, even the other day, we were with the agriculture, and they have a robust strategy. They are bringing us to upscale now the investment in the areas of especially value addition, in the areas of storage, in the areas of marketing, but also research, which we didn't cater for adequately. And in the intervening, in the medium term, these are the areas we want now to push along with the parish development model. And we hope with this deliberate and very well structured intervention, we shall be able to improve the productivity levels of the people. Because we don't just throw the money to them and they produce poor quality agricultural produce, which we can't market and so on. We shall be doing all that. Finally, and it is related, the gentleman who talked about the implementation. One of my second last research works I did before I came this side of the train, which is a very interesting side, I researched about implementation, the implementation challenge in Uganda, from paper to practice. My research is there on the internet, and I'm very mindful of it, and we are trying to address some of these things from where I am. We are talking about getting resources focused more on the beneficiaries and less on the processes. Even projects I've already engaged, a number of people who bring the projects in our technical analysis and meeting to analyze them, including World Bank projects. Please reduce the monies that we spend on processes, on administration, on these project implementation teams, and put more resources to the components which are going to bring results. I know sometimes people say you are putting resources in areas which you think are going to benefit people more, but when you don't fund these teams who will implement these things, I know that question is always there. So we have to be very scientific in this analysis so that we don't end up with the projects which are big in the amount of money dedicated to them, but very thin in terms of, results on the ground. How we measure even the results, how we measure those outputs is very, very critical. You remember something called accountability with the results? That is also very critical because paper accountability is too much as well. In the parish development model, therefore, you will find that the money which goes to administrative costs has been earmarked and it is quite minimal. This 1.059 billion shillings I've talked about, this is money for the revolving fund. Not even a single shilling is to be spent on administrative costs. But also, we are trying as much as possible to give the street-level bureaucrats, the people who are going to implement the model, decision-making powers. Because sometimes the problem with the implementation is giving people resources and you don't give them the power to make decisions. They have to consult. As I always say, in Uganda we have that disease of people not taking decisions. Everybody is consulting another. The parish chief is consulting the sub-county chief. The sub-county chief is consulting the county chief. The county chief is consulting the district. The district is consulting the PS. The PS is consulting the minister. The minister is consulting the cabinet. Cabinet is consulting the president. The president is consulting the people. So you find we end up consulting all the time and we fail to do the simple things. So we are very mindful of this and we are taking very precautionary measures to ensure that we address the decision-making aspect and make implementation real. Mukami, she came in as the country manager of the bank almost at the same time. I came in as PS, and we've been having this conversation sometimes. How do you ensure that you reduce bureaucracies? How do you ensure that you use both the formal and the informal ways of approving, for example, things? And we've been using very simple methods of getting things done. I will pick a call and call the Attorney General and I say, Attorney General, I need this to be looked at by your people quickly. Don't compromise the processes, but let us do it quickly. The Attorney General, within a week, has approved something which has stayed in his office for months and months and months. So we are doing all of this. I wanted to inform this gentleman who was asking to ensure that we make the decision-making quick without necessarily compromising on the quality of the decisions we take, and also getting the resources to do the real things which we want to do, other than funding these teams which are usually the ones benefiting, because there was that accusation that in Ugandan projects, they benefit more the project managers than the beneficiaries. We want to ensure that that does not happen going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gobi. There was, however, although the good doctor is not around, there was a question about what other alternatives for financing are there for these. She talked about the huge infrastructure deficit for one. Do you have...
The experts of financing on this panel. I'm one expert of doing other things. So I would want to bring those alternatives, because I've also been having the same conversation.
So Sam, do you want to take a shot at it, or?
No, thanks, Paul. But she already highlighted that they have in the NDP they have already put alternatives there, things like infrastructure bonds. Probably think of a local bond. It's something I know government has been talking about for some time, to see if they can be able to raise financing locally, because people are willing to participate in the national development, and if there is a mechanism available, then it can be utilized. Green bonds, as she indicated, is also green and ESG bonds are one and the same. But one thing that was highlighted earlier by Gibran is giving credit to government, and for the right reason, probably going to the market. Just like they have done, we have also talked to government over the last 7 to 10 years to go to the debut market, but they have not, and they've done the right thing not to go there, because the results are there to show. But these are there are alternatives out there. From a commercial perspective, it may be expensive now, but as I indicated earlier, that there are things that government can do to try and reduce the spreads. But also one thing to know is that the kind of projects that you're financing, various projects, different projects ask for different financing mechanisms. If it's majorly social, and the returns will only accrue over a very long time, then it makes sense for you to access the appropriate financing for that. If there is a return and there is a commercial return, if we're talking about expanding an airport or a toll road and so forth, the appropriate financing mechanisms like government has been doing.
Just to build on that very quickly, in my line of work, where the needs are always 10 times more than the available resources, we often don't have the luxury to be selective about the financial instruments we have to discuss. But we have to be selective about which financial instruments we choose. I half joke with my colleagues that in our line of work, we're financial plumbers. We put pipes to make sure the money gets to where it's going. I can bet that there are very few of you who know what brand the piping in your house is, which company produced it. But most of you will know if there is a leak. And so when we're looking at financial alternatives, as you've rightly pointed out, there will always be a long list of financial instruments available to you, from loans to guarantees to bonds to different type of color bonds. Now there's, every shade of color bond out there. But I think if you simplify, and this is what I certainly hear from our counterparts in government here, that if you ask the same basic questions, you'll be fine. What's the level of risk associated? What's the level of reward? And importantly, who is bearing that risk and at what cost? And if you can have that initial conversation, it also opens up other conversations about, can you mitigate that risk? And when we are looking at IDA, for example, the donor resources have been falling for years. What we have done is to then introduce the private sector window, for example. And that window has a lot of mitigants that we have included in there. So if you're financing an operation, you can convert it to a local currency operation. You can get insurance, political risk insurance. You can get commercial risk insurance. There are all of these alternatives out there. But ultimately, it all comes down to the same basic question. What's the level of reward? Over what period? What's the level of risk? And importantly, who is bearing that risk? And as long as you've got governments asking who is bearing that risk, I think you are you are in the right spot to make the right financial decisions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Now, the final round of questions. 5. Okay. Oh, well. Okay, well. Your name, organization. Then we shall have the lady in the back there. There's a gentleman on that side. So those are 3. This gentleman, and there's a lady. Okay, there's a lady.
Okay, thank you, the panelists, the keynote speaker, and Paul as well for moderating. My name is Doreen Rubatsimbira from the Bank of Uganda. My question is on the cost of credit. the cost of borrowing, and I know the PSST has already mentioned that we are relying more on concessional borrowing. But then I'd like to address it to Mr. Charles Kabiri, who you did mention a number of initiatives towards managing the cost of debt. And in the current, I would like to ask it in the current global environment where concessional borrowing is going down and economic growth has been interrupted, and also interest rates are rising because central banks are tightening, to curb inflation. So in light of that, what would be your ideal recommendation to mitigate the increasing cost of debt? Thank you.
There was somebody, yes.
Good morning. My name is Alana Kembabazi with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. I think this is very timely, and I want to speak as a young person. We've often felt you're mortgaging our future for something we're not very certain is benefiting our people. And so I think it's good to have frank and honest discussions about the country's debt. The first question I have is for the World Bank. I've had a lot of discussions, focused a lot on Uganda, what can the government do? But there's been very little discussion about the global debt architecture, which as a whole doesn't work for us as Africans. And I think the minister hinted a bit about that in his speech, but I haven't had anything else said about it. So would love to hear from you. I know these discussions have been numerous calls by civil society, particularly over the last 2 years, on rethinking it, and to see what else you think is in the pipeline that is more progressive. We feel the talks happen, but very little is changing. And with what we are seeing about our world today, with multiple crises that seem to just pop up, if we don't rethink it soon, despite our country's best efforts, we'll be caught up in a web. But the second one is to the government. Will you commit to not borrow, to not fund from non-concessional, to not go to non-concessional financing? Is that something that you will commit to do? Because it's something you've talked about. It is discussions that are happening. And the other bit is, it would be good for you as the government to present evidence on how this benefits the people, right? And we know that technically it does, but if, for example, you look at the World Bank's financing 2018 to about 2020, I'll have a look at the 21 data, most of it is going to governance and security. So the ordinary person is saying, okay, in a very concrete way, when I'm dealing with multiple crises and poor public services, how is this benefiting me? So being able to very concretely tell us would be useful, so that we are having more guided discussion. Maybe there's things that are coming through that we don't know from the other side. And the last bit was this very false idea I had that if we use PPPs, we will reduce our debt burden. I want us to stop copying and pasting and to look at Uganda. In what instance in Uganda has the use of PPP actually been cheaper in the long run? Because we are seeing drains to the public purse. We are seeing that there are ways for keeping debt off the books. And so I think we need to begin to look at our contexts. We've even seen other countries, they are moving away from PPPs as a model. So why then is this being pushed as an alternative? I think we need to have critical discussions around that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, members of Parliament around, and our distinguished panelists and distinguished colleagues of mine. My name is Florence Kutesa. I'm here as a retired civil servant who worked in Ministry of Finance for 21 years. And I'm not going to make a request or a question. I'm just going to make an observation that probably I'm one of the senior people here, but I just want to observe that for the time I was in government, to date, we are discussing the same question. 2 years ago, I think I did participate in a similar. Why am I saying this? I think it's high time we did define a very prudent, as we normally say in public finance, or robust framework for sustainable financing. That can, these are my personal views, That can help us organize our discussion and focus on the priority areas and be able to answer the questions. Because if we leave it open year in, year out, we are going to be discussing development in these similar platforms. So my humble request going forward is let's define sustainable financing framework with the key areas. We know that most of the areas we are discussing are being catered for in other sectors, or what now we call programs for the NDP3. And once we have clear indicators, I want to reiterate what Mr. Mayimbo, the Director for Development Finance, said. We want to strengthen partnership. How do we get partnership? How do we get all the stakeholders, including us now who are working in the civil society, to understand what the framework is and what do we need to do? We need to have clear performance indicators, priority. Otherwise, everything will be a priority. But clear targets with clear institutional framework, I just repeat his words, and clear implementation framework, such that when we meet again, Honorable Minister and distinguished panelists, we are focusing on what we committed, government and our partners, if they do agree, to monitor their implementation and what the challenges are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madame Florence. The last person should be lining up behind him. Okay, fine, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Birungi from the Uganda Manufacturers Association. Two questions. One is on the tax to GDP ratio and the measures we are pushing to improve our position on that. I think it's imperative that we hear also from the ministry around the measures in place that ensure that we don't go the way of deepening tax, but rather widening tax. Because I think the challenge has always been that oftentimes the easiest way forward is to deepen tax, target the same people. How do we move away from that and now talk about actual widening of the tax? The second bit is on the issue of how we deal with cost of credit on the private sector side. And I say this because one of the measures of pushing tax to GDP ratio in the right direction is that we have more companies that are able to pay their taxes sustainably. If that is the case, what measures are we envisioning around ensuring that the cost of credit in this market, commercial credit to private sector, becomes more affordable? Switching tack now to the issue of financing, wider financing, and the question Paul asked around how do we move the needle on the issue of savings. I would flip it a bit and also say, how do we actually move the needle on productive savings? What do I mean? I mean the average middle class Ugandan is sleeping in a factory because their home costs the equivalent of a small factory. How do we move the needle on the mortgage industry to ensure that people can unlock these savings and actually use them for productive investment? Because otherwise it's money lying there and it's unutilized. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My name is Francis Robert Kabuye from the Federation of Small and Medium Enterprises in Uganda. I would like to thank the Ministry of Finance for the stimulus package that was earmarked for the SMEs, the Recovery Fund. However, we have a challenge, Mr. PSST, and I think you also alluded to it during your submission. This money was put in commercial banks, 200 billion shillings. It was meant for SMEs to recover from the pandemic, but the challenge now is very few can access the money. The bank requirements are very high, and most of our members, the SMEs, cannot meet the requirements. Interestingly, in your submission, you mentioned, I think you might have got feedback that these people are not getting the money, the intended beneficiaries. And you said you're calling back your team to re-strategize. So we may just, as a federation, would be interested in knowing what strategies are you going to put in place to ensure, or are you planning to put in place to ensure that these people can access the money? Thank you so much.
We're going to take one more question because it seems like we have no choice.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm going to be very brief. My name is Dr. Mili Kwagalo-Yidu. I'm the Dean Faculty of Business Administration and Management in Deji University. It's a private university, and I'm happy to be here. My issue is about the lady who has just been here. It's about the framework that we put in place after putting those very good policies in place, because our government has got very good policies, and we have our persons up there trying their level best to make sure that things move on. But down, it is not trickling. Where is the problem? How do we involve our people down? For example, we are saying building a stronger partnership for sustainable financing in Uganda. But how do we get these people down to be part of the implementation? Maybe that is also a problem. We have the youth. We are in universities, but I'm not looking at only universities, right from primary, maybe nursery. How do we encourage the saving culture for investment, for strategic investment? These are some of the things we are looking at, because we are trying our level best, right from the president, the ministers, everywhere. But now, who is failing these programs? That is where my question is. Thank you
very much. So we'll come quickly. We have to wrap this up. I suspect, again, Mr. Gobi is the man who's got the floor.
Thank you. The younger lady, I didn't get the name, sorry, the representative of the younger people. Very brilliant, very brilliant. Alana, very brilliant questions. I'm not saying others are not. I'm just saying very brilliant questions. You want a commitment from me to reduce non-concessional debt.
To eliminate.
Huh? We scrap it. We scrap it. Easier said. Of course, we say the commitment is we are reducing non-concessional, and in its place try as much as possible to attract concessional debt. But I can't commit to you that it will stop in this year. No country in the world, at least as far as I know, has succeeded in doing that. So we have to, like he said, leave all of these on the plate, but be mindful of the dangers of the non-concession, and that's what we are doing. Where is it spent? I want actually to tell you that the Ugandan budget, contrary to what many people think, its composition is very pro-people composition. This is the budget. I can read for you the top 6 next year. Human capital development is number 1, 9.1 trillion, about 28.4% of the discretionary budget. Number 2 is security and governance, 23%, 7.4 trillion. I know many times people, including my friends somewhere, they are always concerned, security expenditure. Uganda has managed to bring all of this transformation in this place called the Great Lakes region, a place of bad neighbors, of so many other issues, because we are secure. And it is something we must appreciate, and nobody will change that. Number 3 is transport infrastructure. We are building our roads, and this is integrated now, transport infrastructure. 4.3 trillion, 13.4% of the budget. Number 4 is private sector development. About 1.6 trillion, 5%. Energy. Energy, 4.9%, about 1.58 trillion. Agro-industrialization, 4.4%, 1.42 trillion. But I've already told you, even the parish development model of about 1 trillion, count it in the agriculture, because it's going to directly be used to purchase agricultural inputs. So, you are talking of a budget which is putting money in educating people, keeping them healthy, and then they also contribute to their what we call household income growth, and the infrastructure to support the businesses. So that's how we spend this money that we borrow. And I think, unless if you could bring another model, this is one of the best in allocating resources in terms of poor people. On the PPPs, I think you are asking, are they the answer? Are they the silver bullet? Let us stop the silver bullet thinking here. There's nothing like, in my office I put there 3 lessons of development. I've always taught my students. Number 1, no silver bullet thinking. We are always looking at how to improve lives. Number 2, everywhere is different. Don't think that what works somewhere will work also in the same way somewhere else. And number 3, as a lesson of development, is to ensure that whatever you do, feedback is so critical. And therefore, don't overput your mind in projects. I know in our country, sometimes we think projects are everything. It's not about projects. It's about the feedback you get and how you attend to that feedback. So the PPPs are part of that mix. They should be part of that mix. Today, when you are driving on Entebbe Expressway, you are going to the airport, the plane is about to leave you. It will take you a few minutes than when you pass through the old road. That Entebbe Expressway wouldn't be there if the PPP model was not brought forward. And I think you should appreciate if you passed there. Finally, for my senior, Madam Kutesa, and I remember we had some conversation some time back on some of these issues. Thank you very much for raising them. We need to be deliberate now in the way we cooperate, in the way we use our words. If it is a strengthening partnership, let us have the roles very well defined, and each of us will do our part. I thank you. And this is the model which is being used nowadays. I want to tell you we are doing so well with IMF and the structural benchmarks and so on and so forth. We are doing so well with the World Bank and all our partnerships we are having. The only thing is that thing panel. Mokami knows my disease where it is. Maris, you call it panel what? Independent panel. Yes, panel. And it is, I'm the one who causes the problems, but it is really killing me. That one, I don't know how we shall sort it out. Then life will be wonderful with the World Bank. We shall develop the country very well. Thank you.
On that optimistic note, we have to bring this panel discussion to a close. Thank you, people. Thank you, people, for your participation in this last question and answer. Thank you, the panelists. SSTPS, Ramadan Gobi, Charles Kabiri, Julius Kapwepwe, Mr. Samuel Mayombi, and Kuresh for being with us today. Thank you very much for your input.
I apologize for Daniel and the team. There are some questions I didn't answer. Could you allow me a minute? Okay. I shouldn't fail to answer private sector. I would have committed a sin. Daniel, we are actually widening the tax base in our DRM. That's why this year we took a decision not to increase tax or introduce new taxes. It was a deliberate decision to ensure that, number one, we support recovery of the businesses from COVID, but two, to avoid this disease of getting the same people who are paying tax to get more liability, because these new taxes tend to fall on the same people. And our teams have been studying which other areas should we go to ensure that we widen the net of the people who are paying tax. So we are widening, we are not deepening the tax. On the cost of credit, on the private sector side, especially the commercial credit, first of all, we knew that is a commercial bank. That word commercial means what? Commercial. It's here to make money. It's not here to, do philanthropy. And because of that, as government, we put in some kind of shock absorber, the Uganda Development Bank, which has helped Daniel's clients of UMA, Uganda Manufacturers Association, to access low-cost credit, patient credit. And a number of success stories are there. They can be spoken about. But also we are mindful, as he guided us, the director, and that is very important guide to my leaders especially. You can't rely on one stream of financing, one type of financing. We need to leave the entire spectrum open. So the commercial side, how do we incentivize the commercial banks to lend at relatively affordable also rates so that they can make money reasonably? But you need also to ask what is causing the interest rates to become sticky downward, and those are the things we are addressing. The National Planning Authority, working with the other people, including my ministry and the central bank, we've finalized a paper. They have a paper on reducing credit of commercial banks. And we are going to discuss this, on Thursday. It is going through the processes also of through the presidential, I think, economic council to be discussed, and we shall announce the country strategies of reducing the interest rates by knowing very well what is causing them to become sticky, which perhaps we know. Recently there has been a debate on social media. Those debates are the ones which cause interest rates to remain sticky. You need to know that, Ugandans. When you borrow people's money, you pay. And you pay on time. When you don't and you try to dodge, then you cause problems to all others. So all of those things we're going to discuss them, and we see how to strengthen the regulatory framework, how to strengthen also the issues which bring trust to a bit reduce. Because trust is so important in finance. When there is adverse selection, when there are moral hazard issues, then the interest rates will always remain high. Kabuye, about that issue I talked about, the Small Business Recovery Fund, you are bringing about accessibility and bank requirements. Please note This fund is strictly for formal businesses. We want to support them to recover because they employ other people, but also they pay tax. And 3, we want also to incentivize other businesses to formalize, because there you become sustainable, you grow, and create momentum in the economy. But even those who are informal, we got an answer for them, as I said. But now, if there are any issues on those formal ones, finding difficulty in accessing credit, those are the issues we are trying to address. And that's what I talked about. And I will give you feedback on how best this can be resolved. I'm a person who wants always to get feedback, act on it, and then get back to you, and we see how we make things work. Lastly, Dr. Mary, the framework to implement the good policies. Yes, you know, reform is not something which you can sprint on. Reform is a marathon, one step after another. There is no lift. These lifts we use to climb buildings. There is no lift for reform. We use one step after another, and we are reforming. And we shall get there with these frameworks put in place, which we are discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the Honorable Ramadan Gobi. Thank you too, Mr. Gibran Kirishi again, Mr. Julius Kapwepwe, Charles Kabiri, and Mr. Sam Mayumbo for your time on our panel. They've been a very useful panel, I think. Give them a round of applause. I've been Paul Busharez, your moderator. I now cede the floor to Noriana.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists. I would now like to invite the country manager for the World Bank, Mukami Karaoke, to close today's event.
So I'll be very brief because we've had a very rich discussion and I don't even want to attempt to summarize it. And just to say a very big thank you to everybody who has spoken today, both from the audience as well as from the panelists, various speakers. The topic, as we said at the beginning, is something that will not end today. As we heard, it's been discussed for the last 20 years. So continuous exploration of new ways to do things better is where I think we all are. So the two key messages I think we got from the team that Sam led here for this meeting were about the pillars of the Sustainable Development Finance Policy. And I think the discussion throughout the day has really touched on the various elements, debt transparency, the outreach, collaborative arrangements, the collective action, the need for us to monitor, to try to ensure that we choose selectively what we're going to use financing for. So I think all of these themes are things that we have been discussing, and we're very grateful to the Minister, Honorable Minister, and the PS for having hosted us for this event today, and also for setting the stage on where we're going next. We've heard a lot about what you're doing in terms of the DRM, in terms of tax policy, and it's all, I think, encouraging for us to hear today. So I'll stop there and say there is lunch. So please do stay for lunch, and beyond this, we look forward to meeting with all of you in different fora. But a last point to make is that I think Sam said it very well. We are in a very difficult place. So we have a big challenge, I think, collectively here to think about how to move forward carefully in the next few years. And I think we count on everybody to continue to knock on the PS's door. He said it's open, and he's available to have these discussions. And the same, I think, would go for ourselves, for the minister, and for others here. Thank you, and have a great lunch, and a good week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamia. Lunch is served out in the gallery. Please take your name tags. Those will serve as your meal ticket. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're joining us for the afternoon roundtable, the creditor roundtable, that is going to be downstairs in the VIP room at 1:30. Thank you.